This is Duke University.
Okay, we'll start off since you all have classes and such to go to after about 1:15. So I am very happy to introduce an old friend of mine. We've been friends for a long time, not that he's old. David Kinley, who is an Irishman who calls Australia his home. David has been working in the human rights and international human rights area for a long time. He holds now the chair in human rights at Sydney Uni Law School, which is the premier law school in Australia. He has been on the faculties at Australian National University, University of New South Wales. He was a Fulbright Scholar to the States, where he spent time at American University in Washington, D.C. He's worked on human rights law around the world, primarily Asia, Southeast Asia. And his focus the last few years has been on the intersection of the financial world, global financial activities, and human rights. He's come out with 2 books recently. One of them was on human rights and what you might call the international financial institutions, World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank. His most recent book, which has come out, or is just...
No, this is the preparation for it.
Okay, which is in progress, even as we speak, is what David's going to talk about today, which is sort of the other, what you might call uninstitutionalized world of global finance. Derivatives, hedge funds, things like that are becoming increasingly important and really are not that well understood. So David's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open for questions.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, and thank you to the Dean, to Jennifer, to Jim for inviting me here, and for you for coming along. I should just say, by way of introduction, that one of the other reasons I'm here, I'm wearing another hat, is I deal with exchange relations between Sydney and other universities, and we have one with Duke, which is somewhat moribund at the moment. And so I'd actually throw out, I would guess that the vast majority of you here are students by virtue of the fact that you're all eating, and that's the only reason you're here, is because there's a free lunch. But any of you who are interested in the Sydney Exchange, do please see me. I'm around here for the rest of the day. I can certainly tell you the important things about Sydney, like where to get good coffee, what the best surfing beaches are, and where to buy Ugg boots. God almighty, why did you take Ugg boots as one of our exports? Really, that speaks volumes about both nations, let me tell you. Okay, well, this title is Too Big to Fail, Making Global Finance Pay for Human Rights. Now, it is intentionally provocative. As I said, I thought that might be the reason one would get people to come along, and let's hope that in some way it was. Global finance does pay already for human rights, but what can it do more? It also does damage to human rights, so the question that arises there is how do we repair and stop the damage? In effect, what I am doing is more of an exploration of what is or what might be understood as the relationship between global finance and human rights. It is still very opaque. It is very murky. It is, to use a phrase coined by Dick Cheney in an entirely different context, working in the shadows. And so we're trying to cast light on this, and Jim was way ahead of saying this was published or even near published. It's not even written. This is the beginning of it. This is the pulling apart of what I think the subject is. The nature and origins is, though, I think an important indicia of why I'm doing it and maybe why it's important. It is a sequel. I'd like to think it was a sequel, but anyway, a sequel to the last book, which was on the real economy. It was on corporations, on visible things that the commercial world, that the trade world, that the aid world does on human rights, good and bad. And that book left my desk to go to press in September, October 2008, which you may all remember was, in fact, the very month, the day I sent it off was the day that Lehman's went down the toilet. And you were thinking to yourself, good Lord, what impact does this have on global finance or global economy? And that, in a way, was part of the exposure for me to how big global finance and how broad the financialization of the global economic space has become. as I hope to expose to you today. Then earlier this year, there was a meeting in Geneva, which I was part of NGOs, of IFIs, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, ILO, various others, and some human rights activists to look at what the connection was between the economy and human rights. There were economists there as well, more of the wet kind rather than the dry kind. But it was very evident, even in that, being stuck together in the snow for 3 days, that the human rights folk and the economists, even though they were amicable, they were there because they thought human rights were important, really talked at each other from each other's discipline, from the silo of what was comfortable for them. The reaching across was ephemeral rather than really substantial. The third reason why I'm doing this is, like so many academics, is because I'm funded to do it. I've got a grant, and I'm not teaching for the next 18 months, so I've got to do something. And, you know, academics, certainly people like Jim, really just sort of faff around. He and I faff around. And we thought this would be something good to do, and so here I am doing it. Now, why does it matter? Well, global finance, indeed global economy as a whole, is not an end in itself. And this has to be stated and restated. It is a means to an end. The global economy and global finance is a mean to an end. And it is basically and broadly to make a better life for as many people as possible, not just for the few. That is the aim of it. That is its raison d'etre. It is a means, not an end in itself. As such, we do make some presumptions about the negativity of global finance, what it does that is harmful, and about its positive duties, what we think that it should be doing to enhance that objective. The intellectual progenitors of the market economy thought this as well, and this too is often forgotten, inside and outside the economic space. Adam Smith, Ricardo, indeed even Milton Friedman, but certainly Adam Smith, who's the one I'm going to look at briefly here, thought this. You've got to recall, I'm sure some of you here have done Smith in some context, whether it's philosophy or economics or perhaps in law. But Smith was a Scot and a child of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was about liberalism. And what the Enlightenment was focusing on was the betterment of the broader part of the community, not just about the betterment of those who were in the wealthy, privileged positions. That, in fact, was one of the reasons why the Enlightenment had the power that it had. He wrote 2 books, Smith. One that you will be perhaps familiar with is The Wealth of Nations. But before that, 18 years before that, he wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments was him saying, we've got to deal with the margins of society, the poor of society, removed from powerful positions of society, which included, interestingly, for a man and a Scot, and 220 years ago, women. He really was an early feminist. But he was looking at ways in which to do that. And then he thought, what is the best way in which to empower those poor? Basically, it's poor. He thought, grow the economy as big as possible. And the way to do that was his Wealth of Nations book. Invisible hand, pull down the barriers of trade, liberalize the markets. And that, he said, will engender enterprise, and skill will be pushed into the right directions, and hence the pie, the pizza, will be growing as big as possible. So for him, it was very much a means to an end. This, however, I think has been forgotten. One interesting thing, even in Jim in my day, economy could still often be referred to as political economy. And it certainly was the case in Smith's day. He was talking about the political economy. You don't hear that now. The political's been dropped. It's an economic analysis. And yet, clearly, the economy is part of politics. So part of this agenda is putting the politics back into the economy. Human rights, then, has a part to play in this. Human rights is part of our policy, particularly in the 20th century. And therefore, if it is missing within our political arena, it's also missing within our economic arena, and particularly the financial arena. So what I want to do today briefly is to talk about 3 things. So there's 3 parts to the talk. One is looking at the composition and the human rights consequences of global finance. The second is to look at the attitudes and the preconceptions of both sides of the debate, global finance and human rights. And the third is to look at some of the connections between the 2 sides, global finance and human rights. So first of all, the composition and the consequences. The composition of global finance is vast. It involves all sorts of exchanges, and we don't just have the stock exchanges anymore. We have bond exchanges with currency and commodity exchanges. We also have foreign direct investment, a massively growing part of the economy in the last 20 years, particularly with liberalized trade after the WTO in 1994. Venture capital and project finance. Remittances, another massive and evident part of globalization. People who leave largely poor countries, go to richer countries, earn money, send it back, remitting the money. That is now a massive part of the global economy, particularly for poor countries. Aid is changing itself. It's not just a public entity, it's also a private entity. Look at the Gates Foundation of a capital base of 34 billion, giving out about 4 billion a year in aid. That's about the size that Australia gives out in official aid every year. And also you now have what they call PPPs, public-private partnerships, like the Global Fund. So a connection not only between the bilateral, the public entities in aid, but also private entities, whether they're corporations or whether it's things like the Gates Foundation. Taxation regimes are also part of the global financial arena. Banking, both merchant and mainstream, all of these are part of global finance. Some of them are much more familiar to us, but others, such as new financial instruments, such as Jim mentioned, credit default swaps and derivatives, are very exotic, and I'm going to say a little bit about those. Within the global finance milieu, then, there are two broad categories, or at least I'm proposing that there are two broad categories. One is industrial real economy support, like foreign direct investment, to dig a hole in the ground, pull out whatever is there, put it in a ship, and bring it back to be fashioned into cars or whatever. That's one part of the global economy. The other is separate from the real economy, a sort of commercial paper or surreal economy. It's autonomous, it's circular. Keynes, interestingly, in 1930, no less, talked about it as being a casino culture, separate from the real economy, separate from being an industrial support, but just circular in its aspirations, circular in its endeavors. This dimension of global finance has attracted a lot of attention post-2008, post the credit crunch. Lord Turner, who is the head of the British Financial Services Authority, famously called this dimension of the global finance as being socially useless capital. Now, how to label these two? I've been struggling with this, as I said, it's early stages of how to label the real and the surreal. I did start real and surreal, but I don't particularly like that. But I found some help of all people, and rather ironic, given how I'm going to label them, from George Soros, who once recently referred to the post-2008 position as a consequence of unhinged global finance. Ironic, because of course, if there ever was a man who was benefiting from, famous for being involved in speculation, it's George Soros. But what that's allowed me then to do is to say that the speculative, surreal side is the unhinged, not hinged to the industrial economy, separate. The other, associated with the industrial economy, the real economy, is the hinged. Now, hinged finance is problematic enough. The credit crisis really proved this to us. You consider the major global banks, major national banks, but major global banks, all of them were at the center, to some degree or other, of the catastrophic losses and the enormous bailouts in the West, in any case, in 2007, 2008. But all of them, any of them of any size, you look at their website, they will have had fully formed human rights policies. They will have CSR departments and personnel. They will have lawyers that will have been running all over this. And yet, did any of those pick up on the human rights, given that that's what they were supposed to be? They were looking at the human rights risks. Did any of them pick up and foreshadow what the human rights risks would be of the global financial crisis? No. They may have, well, they didn't do a very good job, but they should have picked up on what the financial risks were. They didn't even do that particularly well. They certainly didn't pick up on what the human rights risks were. And they do really plaster these up there. If you're a member of the Equator Principles, or you've signed up to the Principles of Responsible Investment and you're a bank, it's one of the first things that you see when you go onto their website. Of course it is. Equally, and this is very interesting, at the same time in the credit crunch, you did not have a push coming from the human rights side to the states to fill the regulatory space of human rights risk assessment. You didn't have, at the same time, an awareness within the human rights community that what the banks were doing may have huge implications, risks for human rights. So it's a sort of ignorance or blinkeredness, mostly ignorance, on both sides, finance and on human rights. So it's difficult enough, therefore, even when you've got these instruments there, to deal with it in the hinged economy. But what I'm going to focus on today is the unhinged economy. And there it becomes even more difficult, hence the opaque and murkiness. The main reason for this, just to reiterate, is that the unhinged global finance doesn't feed itself through, at least not directly, into the real economy. And as a consequence, then you're able to see the human rights benefits or the human rights abuses in the real economy arena. Because it is circular. It is betting on indexes. It's within itself. It doesn't end up. It may eventually, but it doesn't end up, in a large part, ever getting outside the circularity of the unhinged financial arena. If you think of it in a way of an industrial supply chain, you often hear this in corporations and human rights that talk about that. You can look at how Nike is at the head of it and may be responsible. The question might be, how far down the chain? To the manufacturer of the shoe itself? Yes. To the manufacturer of the laces, who may not be the same one, possibly. But what about the manufacturer of the twine that goes into the laces, or indeed the plastic that goes at the end of each, or the eyelets, or the tin miner that got the tin to have, whatever, probably not tin, probably plastic, the eyelets, whatever. How far down the list? Now, that supply chain is difficult enough to try and conceive of and decide who's responsible for what. But try and put that into the money supply chain. Where did the finance come for each one of those parts of the real economy, or indeed of the speculative economy? Where did the money come from? It's almost impossible even to divine where it came from, let alone to be able to assign responsibility. So you're in a real difficult area here for lawyers, for regulators. What is the composition of this unhinged financial world? It is staggering, and this is one of the reasons why we've got to pay attention to it as regulators, as human rights folk. World domestic product, gross domestic product for the world, all countries, is roughly about 60 trillion US. But it's dwarfed, that 60 trillion is dwarfed by even just one individual segment of the financial markets. The notional exposure of derivatives, the derivatives market alone, is about 1,100 trillion. In other words, 20 times the global GNP is in derivatives alone. Foreign exchange markets, another example, and more statistics. Every day, about 4 trillion US goes through foreign currency markets. Therefore, in 15 days alone, you have a turnover of the equivalent of the global gross domestic product. Credit default swaps, which are difficult for anyone to understand, even the financiers to understand what they are, but this sort of new type of derivative invented in the 1990s and was right at the core, as I'm sure you know, of the global financial crisis. That, and this is one of the reasons why it was so dramatically a part of the global financial crisis, grew almost exponentially. That word exponentially is used somewhat willy-nilly, but here it was almost true. In 7 years, up until 2007, it grew from 600 billion a year, US, to 62 trillion. Now remember what your trillions are. A trillion is 1,000 billion. So it was less than 1,000 billion, and in 7 years it became 62,000 billion. I mean, these are absolutely staggering amounts of money. If you conceive of it as an iceberg, where the vast majority of the economy is actually beneath the waterline, the global finance, 20 times, its shifting or movement has enormous impacts on the bit that you see at the top. And that bit is the bit where human rights are exposed, where we sit, where jobs are, where public finances can assist with social welfare. So the consequences, that's the composition of this unhinged financial arena. The consequences. Because of this massive ball of ice beneath the water. It really does have a huge influence when it moves. That amount of liquidity, or I can't use the word liquidity and ice at the same time, but anyhow, you know what I mean. Liquid ice, yes, that'll do. Really has an impact, and a deep impact, whenever it moves positively or negatively. The positive has been, over the last 8 years, a real enhancement of jobs within the West, but particularly in the poor countries. I mean, China, I was recently in China, of all things, giving a human rights conference in Beijing. That was interesting, hosted by the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are voicing a very real, appropriate success story in human rights. They have, and the World Bank agrees with these statistics, lifted in the last 6 years 250 million people, almost, well, 3/4 of the American population, out of poverty, out of abject poverty. Now, that is unquestionably a human rights success. They're not so good on free press and other sorts of things. We accept that. But that is unquestionably a human rights benefit. And that's been repeated in many other countries, many other, including sub-Saharan countries. So there's been real benefits there. But there have been disbenefits as well, because with the swing of this lump of ice beneath the waterline, you can have immediately the wiping away of those jobs, the wiping away of the tax receipts of governments, poor governments, who are then able to establish social welfare programs. If they don't have the tax receipts, then they lose the ability to be able to provide social welfare. The World Bank has calculated that as a consequence of the 2008 credit crunch, about 80 million extra people have gone beneath the abject poverty line, which brings it back up to about 1 billion. About 1 billion, so that's, slightly more than 1/7 of the global population live on the World Bank's $1.25 a day level of abject poverty. The ILO has estimated that, again, as a consequence of the global financial crisis, 20 million jobs were lost worldwide. Recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food has issued a report to say that one of the reasons why poor are even poorer in the last 3 or 4 years has been because of the enormous hikes in the prices of commodities, particularly staple diets, wheat, rice, corn. And a lot of that was assumed to be caused by biofuels and by the movement of finance into biofuels and away from these basic products, making them scarcer, making their price rises. It doesn't turn out to be that case. It turns out to be speculation on commodity indexes. So not even speculating on owning and passing on wheat or rice, but simply betting on whether the index is going to go up or not, or down. And that commodity speculation has thrust up the price of these staple diets without any consequence, without any thinking of what would the human rights consequences be of those people at the end of the chain who have to buy the wheat, buy the rice. And of course, this isn't just an issue, those 20 million jobs, those 80 million people that are in abject poverty, is not just an issue for the poor world. It's also a substantial issue for a country like the United States. Just 3 weeks ago, the National Census Bureau released some statistics that indicate a significant annual increase in 2009 of the poor in the United States, from 11.1%. Even that seems staggering for a country like the United States. 11.1% live beneath the poverty line in the US, to 14.3%. This now means that 43.6 million people in the United States live beneath the poverty line, which is the highest recorded level since the National Census Bureau started taking statistics in 1959. That's shocking. Whatever the reasons, it's shocking. So that's dealing with the consequences and the composition of global finance. The second point that I'm going to move on to is attitudes. Attitudes on both sides of the debate, human rights and global finance. They've got to learn more about each other, financiers and human rights folk. They've got to learn about each other's disciplines, about how they practice in each other's arenas, and they've really got to do it rather than just paying lip service to it. There are some existing efforts that seek to be midstream, but in fact they're not midstream. When you analyze them, they're still clinging, and my lot, the human rights lot, are just as guilty. They're still clinging to the safety of their own banks when you really look at it. There's a real yawning disconnect between global finance and what it thinks it's doing and why, and what human rights thinks it's doing and why. So let me look at these very briefly. The global financial side. You put human rights to global financiers, and they will say, what's that got to do with us? That's not our concern. It's the concern of the public arena. It's the concern of elected governments. Or even if they're not elected, it's still the concern of governments, not ours. I gave a talk somewhat similar to this in Herbert Smith, which is a big commercial law firm in London in the summer. And the guy who introduced it had been in investment banking. Well, he was a lawyer, but had been advising investment bankers for nearly 25 years. And he said he couldn't recall, when he looked at the title of the talk, he couldn't recall in any of those 25 years ever being in a boardroom or having the financiers in his boardroom ever mentioning the words human rights. It would be as if you were mentioning, dog leashes or something utterly irrelevant to whatever they're trying to do. It would never occur to them of being relevant, possibly private, but certainly not within their professional concern. Even really big, important parts of international law, like bilateral investment treaties. I don't know if you've ever come across, if you know what a bilateral investment treaty is. It's a very simple, it is what it says. It's an agreement between two countries about how investment will flow between the two through private means. There are about nearly 3,000 of those existing today. And they are used in ways that have absolutely no concern, no conception that there may be other treaties that those two countries may belong to, including multilateral ones, that have human rights concerns. Such that you've had some real appalling circumstances where the clauses in a bilateral investment treaty have been used, often called stabilization clauses, have been used as a way to prevent a poor state, or indeed any state, from meeting its human rights obligations. Why? Because if the state takes that action, whatever it is, to increase royalty payments on a mining company, in order to enable them to pay more into the education budget or into the health budget to meet human rights obligations, that will be seen as an essential breach of the bilateral investment treaty, which was to stabilize things at the point that the treaty was initially enunciated. Now, not thinking about the human rights consequences, and even something as simple as that, is really quite catastrophic when you're bringing the big guns of lawyers arguing on a bilateral investment treaty against a poor state, as is happening. What prevails within financial markets, the attitude that prevails, is an insidious insularity. Assumptions are made about what we do is build the pie as big as possible, somebody else carves it up. How free market economics deals with such things as human rights and other social indicia is to move them outside. They're not measurable, so they're externalities. You may have heard of this term. They're public or private sector concerns. They're not commercial. There are some really striking examples of this sort of attitude, and the GFC has the global financial. The Australians use this term, the global financial crisis, and have coined GFC. And when Australians are overseas, or indeed people come to Australia, and they hear GFC, that was Niall Ferguson, who's a Harvard professor in history, gave this talk saying that when he first came across this, and he should know all about this, he's just written his book on the ascent of money, he'd never heard of the GFC, and he initially thought that it was a misprint and people were talking about fried chicken. But in fact, the Australians are always talking about a GFC, so occasionally I'll slip into it. But the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis yielded all sorts of things. One of them was a number of inquiries that Congress held here. And truly, what must be one of the most remarkable testimonies ever given to a congressional inquiry was Alan Greenspan immediately after the 2008 crash. And he said, it's still quite extraordinary that he said this, that he was a mea culpa, the talk, a mea culpa, saying, I had truly the belief that bankers' self-interest would prevent them taking so much risk that they would then damage shareholders. So in other words, shareholders will be assisted by what he believed, the inherent limitation within bankers, venture capitalists, that they wouldn't do something that would hurt shareholders. And yet this is despite the fact within economics there's a really well-documented line in the last 25 years of a movement away from what is called shareholder capitalism, where the grunt is in shareholders, to management capitalism, where the grunt, the real power, is in the managers. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And clearly, therefore, their incentives are going to be different, and their self-interest is going to be different. Really, it's just an extraordinary sort of mea culpa to expose himself to. Another example is what might be called the loose regulatory regimes that exist within global finance, again exposed as being one of the causes of the global financial crisis. This loose regulatory form, which vague attempts, and they are still vague, are being made at the moment to tighten it up, was famously termed by Matt Taibbi, a journalist, a financial journalist, as caveat emptor, dude. Just tough luck. If you're not smart enough, then you lose out, and the regulations won't save you. There's no sort of inherent ethicalness about this. He actually wrote this article about Goldman Sachs in the Rolling Stone of all places. In Rolling Stone, what an amazing! Some of you may have read it. It's one of these real hits on Google. But it was called Goldman Sachs is the giant vampire squid on the face of humanity. And so those of you who are signing up to Goldman Sachs, well, actually, Goldman Sachs, I think, are suffering at the moment from this sort of perspective. But if you look at there's at one stage there were 3 inquiries going on in the US, in Washington, at what Goldman Sachs was doing when it was, I won't go into the details here, or a question if you wish I will, where they were effectively betting against some of their clients to the benefit of some other clients and to their own proprietorial account benefit. Just saying it like that shows you the sort of surely unethical, maybe illegal dimension, but there wasn't, very little of it was illegal, which is precisely my point. How come that's not illegal? Maybe unethical. But that shows you the sort of the caveat emptor dude. It's symptomatic of the casino culture. Okay, so there's that attitude, which I still think is very much endemic within global finance. But human rights is by no means, squeaky clean in all of this. In extremis, the human rights view is that commerce and finance is nasty. It's possibly inherently evil. And it's certainly beneath the high moral ground that human rights folk occupy. It's a real self-assurance that human rights are principled and commerce is not. But this is a real disaster. To think that human rights are not part of commerce and politics on an everyday basis is misguided. They are immersed, must be immersed if they're to have any relevance, deep within them. And what's more, and this is an important part in an arena like this, human rights law recognizes that. And international human rights law expressly recognizes this. I don't know if any of you are or have studied international human rights law. But in all the major instruments, there are limitations clauses, qualification clauses. So you can have a limitation placed on freedom of expression where or when, if it's necessary in a democratic society, if it's necessary to protect public morals or public health, or if it's necessary to protect national security. Now, who do you think decides that? And how do you decide those sorts of limitations? But whoever it is, they are massive. There is a real opportunity there to limit, and as happens, to limit human rights. So it's not as if they are a high moral ground with clear principles that are this side good, this side bad. They're much more woolly. There's much more elasticity in how human rights are actually written in law and promoted through policy. I don't think this is a compromise. I don't think this is seen as a weakness of human rights. I think it's absolutely core to what human rights are all about. They are a social science. They are politically not motivated. They are politically situated. They can't be removed from politics. They're not antiseptic from politics. One of the problems that has occurred in the battle, I think you can call it, in human rights rhetoric, has been that those who have opposed human rights have done so without engaging in what human rights are trying to argue, this elasticity notion. And I've seen this particularly in Western countries. The United Kingdom and Australia are 2 examples of this. The response then of the human rights community has been to get higher on their high horse, to allow their rhetoric to get the better of them, and then to present an argument, and this is true also with finance and with economics, where it does make them appear to be straitjacketed and principled and clear, when they're not. So part of the problem here is that human rights advocates are their own worst enemies. They're making this solid steel shield behind which there are human rights and outside which are human rights violators, whereas in fact it's much more porous than that. And as a consequence, people who run up against that shield say, right, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that. This is classic within many, not all, but many Asian states who rebel against the idea of human rights being universal and say, no, they're just Western. Well, it's true also about financial and economic reactions to say, those sorts of things can't be for us because we don't have high-principled elements of what we're doing in the economy. It's not that sort of philosophical basis. So where do you go to from here? This is my third and final point of making the connections between these two sides, who, at least in that last section, I seem to paint as being implacably opposed to each other. There are three organizing themes, which I'm just going to briefly allude to, that I think are a useful way to investigate these connections. One of these is to address exclusion. And I mean by this principally two types of exclusion. And again, statistics really tell a story here. The UNDP has a commission that issued a report 2 years ago on legal empowerment of the poor. And it estimates that 4 billion people worldwide, 3/4 of the world's population, live outside any form of formalized legal system. I mean, so in a way it shows that as lawyers, especially if any of you have a wish to be involved in development or aid, you're not going to be doing it through the things that you learn 90% of the time in this law school or in Sydney. You're going to be doing it in much, much more nuanced, discrete, policy-oriented, politically oriented, socially oriented ways. Because these people just simply don't have anything like the sort of legal system that you're looking at. And you end up, like all law students, only looking largely at what happens at the appellate bodies, for Christ's sake. It's only a little bit when you get into clinics do you ever get down. And the appellate bodies are even more removed from what happens in the vast majority of the legal system. So just bear that in mind. No formalized legal system whatsoever. And this has real human rights and financial implications. It means that there aren't formalized dispute settlement systems. There may be some form of dispute settlement, but it's not not state sanctioned. It's just cultural, it's traditional. There are no labor laws for the poor who are largely, in these circumstances, working in the informal economy. And perhaps most fundamentally, there are no property rights. This is a huge issue within poor countries, within developing countries. With no property rights, you're not able to get out of the cycle of poverty because you're not able to leverage against your property rights to borrow, to move out, to sell, to develop if you don't have property rights. The other part of exclusion that I want to look at was finance. And again, another body, a collection of international bodies, estimate that 2.5 million people live outside any form of the financial system. So they don't have any access to anything like a bank, anything like borrowing money, except in the most informal way from neighbours or your next door neighbour. Neighbours do tend to be your next door neighbours, don't they? But neighbours or friends. This, of course, is bad not only for the individual. I mean, this is an important point. It's also bad for the state because the more people you have outside the financial system, then those people cannot, by that very fact, contribute to the taxation system, and therefore the state doesn't have the tax receipts. So it relies on aid, and hence you get the problem of aid being an eternal circle for these people in these countries. There are moves here in the right direction. Microcredit is one, and it is remarkably successful, particularly for women, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's an extraordinary story. Mobile phones and mobile money is actually a big part of this as well. It's allowing people to have access to microcreditors, however they're presented, through a mobile phone. Most of the developing world, as you probably know, have just moved from no phones to mobile phones. They never had landlines. Landlines? What are they? It'd be lovely if we had done the same thing, but we haven't. So they've just gone straight to mobile phones. But that's really made a difference. And of course, philanthrocapitalism itself has been important in promoting these sorts of microcredit and mobile credit moves. The third connection area is simply alleviating poverty. This is, of course, a moral economic, political responsibility of the globe, and particularly of the West. It's got a legal dimension to it as well, but frankly, I don't think that legal dimension carries the weight that it can't carry the weight. There's a whole movement in the international legal world to have a right to development. An international right to development fell apart in 1986. There's a declaration on the right to development, but there's no treaty. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think you've got to be looking at the politics of this and the economics of this, not the legal. It's not as if having a right to development will suddenly make the West more amenable to paying to the South. That's not going to happen. But more than 1 billion people, as I said, live in abject poverty. The West has promised to give 0.7% of its aid, 0.7 of its gross national product to aid. 0.7, that's not a hell of a lot. Only 5 countries achieve that. Now, the Nordics, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Nobody else achieves it, anywhere near it. Australia is appalling, 0.3%. You guys are even worse, 0.2%. Japan and Italy are not worth mentioning. There is moves to try and increase the aid budget. There's a thing called the Robin Hood tax, which actually, interestingly, came from Britain. I don't know if you ever come across this. If you are interested in this, go put Robin Hood tax in Google, and there's a fantastic 3-minute YouTube on Robin Hood tax. It's really very good, and it just gives you the line of what Robin Hood tax is about. It's a financial services or financial transactions tax, minute, tiny tax on every financial transaction that's made on the markets, but yielding, as a consequence of so many of those, an enormous amount of money. Conversations about whether it's a good or bad thing. There is a problem with aid in that it is now being militarized. The vast majority of US aid now goes to 2 countries. What are those 2 countries? Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying Afghanistan and Iraq don't need them, but it does mean that where military goes, aid now starts to go, rather than to other places that may need it. So military leads the way, and this is problematic. Philanthrocapitalism, however, has at least started to move against this. I mean, the Gates Foundation is a major player. The other part of alleviating poverty is the financial part, or the financial services part. The debt, servicing debt requirements of poor countries is still ruinously obscene. The total for developing states of their outstanding external debts, that is, their state owes debts to private companies, banks, or to other countries, or to the IMF or the World Bank, is, again, this figure hardly means anything, it is 3 trillion. 130 states, there's 190 odd states in the world, regularly spend 20 to 30% of their GNP servicing their debt. And that is many times more than the combination of what they spend on education, social welfare, and health. I mean, how can that be so? And they're paying nearly all of this to the West, private and public sector in the West. The West itself is mired in debt. The difference is, though, it can deal with it. I mean, the US paid, I was just looking this, US paid $383 million in interest on its 12 trillion debt. That's what it holds at the moment. 12 trillion debt is the, most of it, or a large part of it in China. And those were debt bonds that it held in 2009. And yet, what was its education budget? So I'll just say that over 300 million. Its education budget was 53 billion. So if I said million there, I meant billion. Sorry. So billions. So you've got 5-6 times more is spent on servicing the US debt, which you can afford, than is spent on education. And finally, in this area, perhaps the most appalling part of what banks have done in debt, where there is a crisis and the banks seek to bring back the money, repatriate the money into the West, you really have seen the rapacity of the Western banks. I mean, it's what they say they will be doing. They're looking after their shareholders. But take the Asian financial crisis in late 1990s, and just Indonesia in particular. Like many countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia was having huge problems. Its private sector was having huge problems paying the debts that it owed to Western financiers. And what the financiers did is that they insisted that the Indonesian government should socialize, nationalize all those debts of all those private Indonesian debtors. It then took the responsibility for paying the full 100% that was due to the West back, and took on the chin what were the losses of its own private sector. And that loss was about 72%, so 72 cents in the dollar. But who got paid? The Western banks. Who lost out? You'll think the government of Indonesia. No. Who lost out? Well, the people of Indonesia, because they then lost the tax receipts. Now, they had to deal with that loss, and that was pulled back through a diminution in social welfare payments. So it's those sorts of things under the radar that have immense and direct effect on human rights that we need to pick up on. Finally, and let me finish, I want to have some time for questions, I'll just do this very briefly. The third area that I think we should be looking at is the augmentation of leadership. Two sectors here, but I'm only going to focus on one. One is the private sector itself. You've got corporate social responsibility, you've got codes of conduct coming out of your ears, you've got FTSE for good, you've got Equator principles, but really, do corporations put their money where their mouth is? So one of the most interesting things I've been involved in recently has been working with tax accountants. They can be extremely interesting. In fact, remarkably so, where they show you that, and they say, which I think is a lovely line, that the true value, the true litmus test of corporate social responsibility is how much tax does that corporation pay? Because that does have a direct effect on social welfare and human rights issues. How much do they try and evade rather than avoid tax, or avoid rather than evade tax? 220 of the top United Kingdom companies, don't pay any tax year after year. How can that be so? It's quite the same here. Enron put in year after year tax losses, yet it was supposed to be the golden child of American industry. In fact, one of the guys I've been working with said that what he thought was most fascinating was that the tax departments of Enron became profit centers. Just think of that. In other words, the tax centers should be deciding how much tax we're going to pay, but so profitable were they in, or so good were they in reducing the tax that they actually made a profit. So these sorts of things do show that perhaps the private sector is not putting its money where its mouth is. But the most important area of leadership is political. You've got to have the states, you've got to have the leaders of the states, the West and those that are in the South, and when they come together in multilateral organizations, leading the way here. Remember that, as I go back to my opening theme, that finance and commerce are means to an end. Therefore, they're regulated. No free market in any case, and certainly not the global market, is free of regulation. It takes a hell of a lot of regulation to make sure that you have a free market. Look at the WTO. WTO is, if any of you have done international trade law, you know how complicated the trade law is. If any of you have done EU law, even more complicated because it's been around longer. And yet what it's meant to be doing, it's meant to be making freedoms within the areas of commerce. So you know you have to regulate it. So the state already regulates. Why should it not therefore be regulating with greater view to the human rights implications of its global financial system? It doesn't. And we, I feel, have to do more to ensure that the politicians, whether it's the G20 that's about to meet in Seoul, or our own individual politicians here that you're about to re-elect or not on the 4th, that you should be pressing to take these sorts of things into account. Thanks so much, and I've got some questions, I hope, if you've got them.
5 or 7 minutes. Any questions for David?
What nation do you think is doing a good job of balancing the interests of the financial world with the interests of the human rights world? Which nation do you think is doing the best job?
Norway. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, which is almost wholly based on North Sea oil. They have instituted a principled investment scheme, the Norwegian government, on how they invest that sovereign wealth fund. Quite different from what both the Saudis and the Chinese do, who are two other they are the two actually the biggest players on the sovereign wealth fund investment front. So the Norwegians are very astute about that. They also have fed it back into their own economy for the poor within Norway, because they do exist. So putting me on the spot as to which country, that's what I would say. Norway is a real leader in this. Sir?
What do you think has allowed Norway to be successful? A lot of people about the social program success in Norway has to do with them being homogenous societies, and that allows that to happen more easily. But do you think that's true at all, or why do you think they're able to do that? Why is it politically viable?
They're small. That matters a lot. They are quite insular, although they're not as homogenous, of course, as one thinks. That they had a big immigration program. In fact, they have problems at the moment with some South European immigrants, and then the right wing. Well, the whole of Europe is having this response, the right wing response to them in their society. Charity and goodness begets charity and goodness, and they are, like, there's just about to come out, the World Development Report is about to come out next week, and Norway yet again tops the most developed nation on earth in terms of all sorts of indicia, and it's been there for 10 years. So they like that, and one of the things they like about it is that they are seen as good. I mean, wherever we go in aid stuff, you have the Norwegians already there doing, they really do have a big aid program. They're the biggest of all the aid donors. And your question was about sovereign wealth fund, which is not aid necessarily, but that's outside the aid budget. They are maybe even over 1% of GDP. So, it gets into the culture, and then the culture begets, better action.
So increasing the quality of life in developed countries will actually lead to better human rights.
Well, I come from Northern Ireland. I was brought up in Belfast, and the way in which things got better there was not through the military or not through law. It was eventually through economics. And when people had something to lose, education, a house, a job, rather than nothing to lose, then they didn't want people throwing petrol bombs and shooting Armalites. And that's what keeps, it's a small example, but that's what keeps Northern Ireland hit lid on at the moment. Not that there was a legal deal by Blair and Bertie Ahern. Sir?
As I understand, in England's attempts to balance its budgets, one of the few social programs that are actually going to be growing is that they're going to increase their aid.
Yeah, I know. You're right.
And I was wondering, do you know what the response has been on the ground, and how did they justify that? Was it a tough fight for the?
Yeah, it's interesting that this government would do it as well. But I was talking to somebody yesterday in New York who, I didn't know this, that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is Ministry of State equivalent, or State Department equivalent to you, budget has been cut by just about the same amount as the increase in aid. And what he was alluding to was the fact that the sort of politics, international politics that's done by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office will now be done under auspices of DFID, the aid, but in fact it'll still be strategically aligned political movements with aid on the rice bag rather than politics and diplomats and gin and tonics. So, and that goes back to my point earlier about militarization, and here is the same thing, Now I was looking at this recently, I'm doing another paper on the militarization of aid, and there are 3 or 4 places that within Washington that now deliver effectively aid packages, whether it's military stuff, whether it's peace, or whether it's through USAID. So it's actually starting to, aid has been seen as a very useful tool for political ends, geopolitical ends. So it may be that this is just sort of smokes and mirrors there for my friend. It's not as if it was that hard a battle. Money was just moved from one place to the other. Sir?
Come on. In foreign aid, a criticism from the developing world about IMF and World Bank lending has been the austerity measures and the conditionalities driven by global financial interests as opposed to human rights interests. Yeah. Where do you think that balance lies?
It's still there. I mean, the IMF nearly died a death in 2007, 2008, almost became utterly irrelevant. And they were laying off people. I remember when I was doing stuff on the other book, I was talking to people in the IMF, and it really did look like it was one of the Bretton Woods babies that was just going to have to go off into old age and disappear and be pensioned off. But just when the global financial crisis came, it sort of received this verve of life, and they've just increased its budget threefold, supposedly to give out much more grants, be much more liberal, and much less conditionality, the austerity measures that you're talking about, the so-called belt tightening. But in the end, the IMF is still party to those who finance it. And those who finance it are the West and Saudi Arabia, and to some extent China. And what they want is ultimately what the IMF does. It's not as if it's got an independent mandate. Well, it has a mandate, but the mandate is written and overseen, like all international institutions, by the members that make it up. WTO are always telling you this, but the IMF is the same thing. And the IMF was complicit in that Asian financial crisis stuff that I talked about in Indonesia. The IMF were pressing for that very outcome, so that their coffers or the coffers of their members were replenished. First and foremost, they have priority, and the poor countries will deal with it. And if they're dysfunctional, well, that's their problem. Well, no wonder if they're dysfunctional, if they're sort of raped in terms of the money that they have to wear, when it could equally and should equally be worn by the stupid creditor. Why did they think this was a good idea? You've got to take the rap. You've got to take the rap. You've invested in there. Doesn't mean you can always then get it back. So they're changing also the voting regulations in the IMF. Just at the last Seoul meeting, you know how they have all these preparatory meetings before the big honchos come along to Seoul in next week or week after. Finance ministers met this weekend, the weekend's just passed, and they have agreed to take away 2 of the European seats on the IMF on the voting board. It's ridiculous that the Europeans had 8 on it in any case, which is Belgium and the Netherlands or something, and Ireland as well. They didn't have one, but that's the sort of size we're talking about. So they're giving them up and giving them to 2 other tiny little nations, Brazil and India. But I mean, that's what should be happening. That's what should be happening. Brazil and India were sharing a goddamn place on the IMF. Sorry, yeah. 2 more questions, you and then that's it.
I'm a little curious what the normative implications of your theory is for business behavior. You mentioned the example of when financial companies were speculating on wheat or whatever commodity it was, that negatively affected human rights.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking what the counterfactual would be for the business, right? Would they refrain from that kind of speculation?
Yeah, that's a good
it seems like they have no choice to engage in this type of speculation.
You're right, and the fact that now casino culture is this wild thing, way beyond what Keynes would have seen in 1930, doesn't mean that you can legislate it away. It's been there for a long time, as long as finance has been around, or at least in the modern industrial world. And if you do try and block that, they will simply find another way in which to bet on things. These new financial instruments are precisely that. They're new because they go round whatever regulations are put in their place. So I'm writing this piece, actually there's a paper that develops this that I'm just putting up in SSRN if people are interested, in which my financier colleague, who's a hardcore financier, says whatever you put up, that's what their job is. That's why they're the smartest guys and girls in the room. They'll find a way around it. So that, you're right. And so I'm left stuck saying, well, I'm just appealing to your better nature? Perhaps so. Maybe there will be no regulatory response. Don't ever let this out of this room. And there was one of the, yes.
Do you think that global financial aid actually works against alleviating poverty, particularly like in African countries where it's known that it doesn't reach the people and it's essentially financing corrupt governments, but Western countries keep sending it?
It's a problem. Certainly, Jeff Sachs talks about needing to fix the plumbing, which is what you're talking about, water coming in and just getting stuck. I don't know if you're alluding to debt aid. If you are, I think it's an appalling book. I mean, she's arguing that you just turn off the aid tap and that you let the African states stand on their own feet by going out and raising bonds against their own account, saying, oh, you invest in us. And the book was published in 2008 as the bond market collapsed. And yet the book and her work became very successful in that respect. I think it's good for it gives you an endpoint of where not to go. Of course there is an obligation to have aid. And yes, it doesn't go to the right places. And there is a lot of, this is a good Australian phrase, like GFC is maybe not a good one, there's this thing of boomerang aid, where you put the aid into the country, but in fact what you're doing is you're paying consultants to go and do it. They spend tiny amounts there, bring all the money back, and it's spent back in your home. So it's boomerang. It's not really going there at all. You're leaving a little bit of intellectual property, but that's about it. So I think you can't turn off. I mean, it's minuscule. 130 billion is what the total aid package is for all the West. It's tiny amounts of money. And I think it's incumbent on us at the very least morally and ethically to be doing it, but we should be finding ways to fix the plumbing, not to just turn the tap off.
All right, well, provocative as always. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.